Hello, and welcome to Life Diaries, a space where the pages of life open up, one story at a time. These are tales written by experience, spoken from the heart. Take a moment for yourself, and let's begin. 20-year-old Ryan sped along the deserted highway. His driver's license was a recent acquisition, but he had known how to handle a car since he was young. His father, David, had taught him the basics of driving. Together, they often cruised these empty roads, coming to the village to visit his grandmother. And now Ryan was returning from the village, but this time he wasn't alone behind the wheel. A feeling of adulthood, complete freedom and independence overwhelmed him. It was a truly wonderful sensation. Loud music poured from the speakers, and the car's trunk was overflowing with generous treats from his grandmother. Ryan had come to the village specifically to help his dearly loved grandmother with the garden work. He felt genuinely sorry for the elderly woman. She had withered with age. It seemed only her spirit clung to her fragile body, but she couldn't abandon the lifelong habit of working the land. Year after year, his grandmother stubbornly sowed the beds, carefully tended the plants, and in the autumn gathered a rich harvest. Moving to the city, where her adult children and numerous grandchildren lived, she flatly refused. Therefore, relatives took turns visiting the old woman, provided whatever help they could, chatted, and shared the latest news. After getting his license and becoming the owner of a car, a used black Lada Priora, Ryan started visiting his grandmother more often than other relatives, and there were several reasons for this. Firstly, as the youngest grandchild and the only boy among 6 sisters, both full and cousins, he had always remained his grandmother's favorite. A special, invisible bond had long been established between them. They understood each other without words, with half a glance. Next to his grandmother, Ryan still felt as warm and cozy as he had in his distant childhood. There are mama's boys, but he was definitely a grandma's boy. Well, and secondly, in that very village lived she, the beautiful Sarah, the daughter of his grandmother's neighbors. In childhood, she had seemed to Ryan an unbearably nasty and annoying girl. Skinny and pale, she constantly tattled to her parents about the noisy group of boys, which included Ryan at the time. The boys tried to get revenge on the little tattletale at every opportunity. Sometimes they'd throw handfuls of dry berries at her back. Sometimes they'd invent the most offensive taunts and shout them right in the girl's face. But one day, arriving at his grandmother's for the summer holidays, Ryan suddenly realized how much everything had changed. Sarah had transformed from an awkward teenager into a delightful young woman, and her character had changed too. She no longer complained about the boys or looked down on them, full of contempt. Sarah joked wittily, laughed infectiously, and there were always many topics of conversation with her. In the evenings, she shone at the dances in the village club. In short, on the eve of starting 11th grade, Ryan finally understood that he was in love. He began actively paying the girl attention. Sometimes he'd present a hastily gathered bouquet of wildflowers. Sometimes he'd offer her a ride on his bicycle to the post office. Sometimes he'd help carry a heavy bucket of water from the well. However, Ryan turned out to be just one of Sarah's numerous admirers. He had too many rivals ready to compete for her attention. The girl clearly preferred Mark, a guy who lived on the next street. This fact, it seemed, only fueled Ryan's feelings more strongly. He firmly decided to fight for his love and did so tirelessly for almost 4 years. Sarah, like him, successfully entered university after finishing school. But Mark remained in the village. His father had fallen seriously ill, and his mother couldn't cope alone with caring for her sick husband and managing the household. Without the help of their eldest son, the family would have had a very difficult time. So the guy stayed home, found a job, and continued to support his family in this difficult situation. Sarah came home every weekend, and the first thing she did was hurry to her boyfriend. Over the week, she would miss him terribly and eagerly awaited these meetings. Ryan, on the other hand, believed that all the trump cards were now in his hands. Mark stayed there, in the village, while he, Ryan, was here, in the city, right next to Sarah. Plus, he had passed his driving test, and his father had even given him a car afterwards. What wasn't there to envy in a suitor? But Sarah continued to treat Ryan as her friend, nothing more. Her heart belonged entirely to Mark. Ryan couldn't reconcile himself to the beauty's choice and couldn't understand why she preferred someone else to him. He continued to persistently seek Sarah's favor, unwilling to give up. "You're very nice, really very nice," the girl told him more than once, trying to explain. "You'll definitely meet your love, fall for someone else. Look around. There are so many wonderful girls." "I only need you and no one else," Ryan insisted stubbornly, not listening to her arguments. "But that's just impossible," Sarah shrugged, looking at him with regret. "Mark and I are getting married soon." Ryan tried to convince the girl that she was making a big mistake, showering her with bouquets of roses and expensive gifts. At some point, Sarah simply stopped accepting them, and Ryan even started stalking her. He hated Mark, although they had played together a lot as children. Ryan constantly pointed out to Sarah what he considered obvious flaws in his rival, but nothing helped. After studying for 2 years in the city, the girl made a decision and transferred to the university's distance learning program. This was done so she could be near Mark and help him care for his sick father. This act was completely incomprehensible to Ryan, causing him bewilderment. His feelings for Sarah hadn't cooled at all, remaining strong and burning. The girl was right. Many beauties were always circling around Ryan, ready to respond to his attention. But for some reason, none of them caught his eye or aroused his interest. Ryan often went to his grandmother's not only out of love for her, but also because of Sarah. To see her even from afar, to admire her light gait, her long, dark, shiny hair, her huge green eyes, that in itself was true happiness for him. Unfortunately, the girl didn't communicate with him at all now. Moreover, it seemed she even feared him and tried to keep her distance. He had, of course, clearly overdone it with his overly persistent courtship, scaring her away. But Ryan wasn't about to give up now. Retreating wasn't in his nature. A truly insidious, cunning idea was already brewing in his head. The guy decided to approach from another angle, from Mark's side. He planned to show up at his work sometime during the week. Ryan planned to bring a couple of his friends, strong guys with bats, to have a serious talk with Mark. If he could scare Mark and force him to break up with Sarah, then who knows, maybe the girl would finally pay attention to Ryan. She would surely need support, someone to care, and he, at the right moment, would of course be there, ready to offer his reliable shoulder. This was exactly the plan Ryan was thinking about now, pressing the gas pedal to the floor of his car. The road ahead was smooth and completely empty, allowing for high speed. The guy felt like he wasn't driving, but literally flying over the asphalt. A dense forest approached the road from both sides. The leaves on the trees were already starting to turn yellow, heralding the imminent arrival of autumn. Soon the trees would be dressed in a lush outfit of gold and crimson. Ryan very much hoped that by then Sarah would finally be his. Of course, the guy perfectly understood that his plan, to put it mildly, smacked of meanness and baseness. But he believed that in love, as in war, all's fair. Sarah had to be his, period. He didn't consider any other options. Ryan had been used to getting everything he wanted since childhood. It had always been that way. Suddenly, the guy noticed a small, dark dot on the road in the distance. It separated from the edge of the forest and was quickly approaching the highway. Ryan instinctively slowed down. Maybe some animal was crossing the road? Judging by the size, it was quite large. Dusk was already starting to gather, and it was quite difficult to make out anything ahead. The distance between Ryan's car and this strange object was inexorably shrinking. Soon the guy realized with surprise, it wasn't an animal at all. A child was standing on the side of the road. This was incredible and utterly inexplicable. The nearest village was about 50 kilometers away, and the city was just as far. This was a completely deserted, uninhabited place. How could a small kid end up here? Got lost, maybe, coming out of the forest? Ryan stopped the car next to the child, opened the door, and carefully looked at the boy. He was clearly in a state of deep shock. A disheveled, frightened boy, about 10 years old, was shaking with a strong, heavy tremor. His clothes were crumpled and torn in several places. The child's face seemed vaguely familiar to Ryan, as if he had seen it somewhere before. "What happened to you?" he asked the boy as gently as possible. He tried to answer, but only a choked wheeze, like a moan, came from his throat. Ryan understood. This was a consequence of the terrible fear he had experienced. "What happened?" The guy repeated his question, trying to make his voice as soft and kind as possible so as not to frighten the child further. And then the boy couldn't hold back and burst into tears. Tears streamed from his eyes, flooding his dirty face. He cried, trembling with his thin body, although he was clearly trying his best to suppress the sobs tearing from his chest. Ryan's heart constricted with deep pity for this frightened, unhappy child. The poor thing must have gotten lost in the forest and suffered terrible fear. The guy got out of the car, walked up to the boy, and did something that was, generally speaking, completely out of character for him. He hugged the kid tightly, pressing him against himself. The child somehow immediately relaxed in his embrace and sobbed even harder, burying his face in his chest. Ryan stroked the boy's head and quietly repeated that everything would be all right now, that the worst was already over. "No, it's not over. It's not the end yet." The boy suddenly pulled away from him and looked directly into his eyes. "Mom's there. Uncle Alex is holding her captive. And now that I've run away, he'll definitely kill her." What? An unpleasant, chilling cold ran down Ryan's spine. The theory about the boy lost in the forest, which had formed so neatly in his head, crumbled in an instant after these terrible words from the foundling. Everything turned out to be much more serious than he could have imagined. If, of course, the boy was telling the truth and not raving from fear. He took us away and kept us in a cage for a very long time. Mom helped me escape, but he came back when I was leaving. I heard his car approaching the cabin. Now Mom will be in a lot of trouble because of me. He'll be angry. A forest cabin. Cages. Ryan couldn't fully understand yet what exactly had happened there, but it all sounded terrible, like a nightmare. The guy suddenly realized that he himself was in danger. What if this mysterious Uncle Alex comes running out onto the road after the child right now? "Let's call the police immediately," Ryan suggested to the frightened boy, trying to sound confident. "They'll come. You'll tell them everything, okay?" "Yes! Just hurry, please!" The boy was in real panic, shaking. He was clearly very worried about a loved one, literally beside himself with fear and anxiety. Ryan looked at the child more closely, trying to focus. Large gray eyes, a slightly upturned nose, a scattering of freckles on his tanned face. Of course. The guy finally remembered where he had seen this boy before. Just a couple of weeks ago, a woman and child had disappeared in the city. They had gone to the cinema and then simply hadn't returned home. All the lampposts in the city were plastered with their photos, and these pictures kept popping up in online news feeds. And then the news, as always happens in such cases, quickly lost its relevance. A school burned down in the city, and another major incident occurred. Now everyone was only talking about these events. The search for the woman and child, of course, continued, but it no longer generated as much public interest as before. And now, completely unexpectedly, before Ryan stood the very boy whose photos had been so frequently seen everywhere just recently. The guy even remembered his name. "Is your name Ethan?" Ryan asked, looking him in the eyes. "Yes," the boy nodded, not taking his eyes off him. "Call the police quickly. Mom has very little time. He'll be furious." Ryan, without losing a second, dialed the necessary numbers and briefly but clearly explained the situation to the dispatcher who took the call. He asked for a police unit to be sent immediately because a woman, the mother of the boy he found on the road, was presumably in mortal danger in the forest. The guy could only explain his exact location approximately, orienting himself by the kilometer markers. But he was assured that his mobile phone signal had already been tracked and located, so they would be found. All that remained was to wait for help to arrive. Ryan invited the boy to get into the car so he wouldn't freeze on the roadside. The child obediently settled into the passenger seat next to the driver. "Maybe you want some chocolate? I have some in the glove compartment." Ryan remembered he had an untouched bar of chocolate he had brought for the trip. Eth shook his head negatively, showing no interest. It was understandable. He wasn't in the mood for chocolate at all right now. Ryan saw that the boy was in a terrible state from the stress he had experienced and unbearable anxiety for his mother. The guy really wanted to somehow distract the child, to make him feel a little better, but he had absolutely no idea how to act in such situations, and so he just sat silently beside him, hugging Eth's thin shoulders. The kid, despite his young age, turned out to be a real hero. He managed to escape from the kidnapper, find his way in the dark forest, run out to the road, and call for help. Ryan looked over Eth's head at the dark trees from which he had emerged onto the highway. What if that very Uncle Alex is watching them from there right now, waiting for the right moment to pounce? Ryan remained alert the whole time, ready at any moment to step on the gas and speed away from this dangerous place. Finally, in the distance, the long-awaited flashing lights appeared. "Police!" Ryan exhaled with relief, feeling the tension leave his body. Only now did he realize how tense he had been the entire time. 2 patrol cars and an imposing Gazelle van with a small squad of police officers pulled up to them. They were in helmets and bulletproof vests, tall, strong, looking dangerous and determined. Uncle Alex definitely wouldn't be able to handle these guys. "See? Everything will definitely be all right now." Ryan patted Eth reassuringly on the back, trying to calm him. He looked at the uniformed people with eyes full of hope. The boy was led aside by 2 men in plain clothes, presumably investigators. They asked the child questions, probably finding out the details of the terrible story and clarifying the location of the cabin where Eth's mother remained. Finally, the uniformed people resolutely headed into the forest, while Eth, Ryan, and a few police officers remained waiting on the road. There was only one thing left for them to do: wait for the search results. Ryan watched the boy, who didn't take his eyes off the dark wall of the forest. A woman in uniform approached Ryan, introduced herself as a police captain, and informed him that she needed to take his statement as a witness. The guy nodded, understanding that he was now an integral part of this entire story. Simply driving away and leaving everything behind was no longer an option. Time dragged on endlessly. It seemed to have stopped. An ambulance arrived. Eth was taken into the ambulance, probably because the doctors needed to examine him and make sure he was all right. "No, I'm not going anywhere! I'm staying here!" The boy's loud, desperate voice suddenly rang out. "I won't go anywhere without Mom!" Ryan understood that they wanted to take Ethan to the hospital, but he categorically refused to leave until he knew his mother was all right. And Ryan perfectly understood the boy's feelings, his anxiety. The child jumped out of the ambulance and ran up to Ryan. Ryan took Eth's hand, feeling him tremble. The two of them stood on the side of the road and looked towards the forest. It seemed calm, impassive, just an ordinary forest. Ryan had driven past this spot many times during the 2 weeks the boy and his mother had spent in the cabin, and he couldn't even imagine that something so terrifying and horrible was happening somewhere there, behind the trees. Finally, the police appeared from the forest. First came those in helmets and bulletproof vests. Their faces were serious. They walked briskly towards their gazelle. 2 strong guys were leading a man, plump, in a stretched-out red sweater and sweatpants with baggy knees. Ryan immediately understood that this was the very Uncle Alex, but he couldn't make out his face in the gathering darkness. The man's hands were behind his back, forcing him to walk literally bent in half. The boy squeezed Ryan's hand harder, his fingers digging into his palm. He watched the man in the sweater with a frightened, unwavering gaze until he was pushed into the gazelle van. The vehicle was already pulling away from the roadside when 2 more police officers emerged from the forest. They were carefully helping a slender woman with large gray eyes, just like Eth's, to walk. "Thank God she's alive!" Eth cried out in joy and rushed to the woman, hugging her tightly around the waist. She, barely standing, wrapped her arms around her son's shoulders. Both of them sank right into the grass on the roadside and sat there, silently looking at each other, unable to utter a word. The police didn't disturb them. They all perfectly understood what was happening at that moment. Ryan watched this incredible reunion of mother and son, and his heart was filled with the most varied, contradictory feelings. The guy didn't immediately notice that tears, hot and unstoppable, were rolling down his cheeks. This was the release of the emotions that had overwhelmed him the entire time he was waiting. How much had happened in those few minutes? It was simply incredible, like in a movie. Right before Ryan's eyes, the plot of a gripping thriller unfolded. Only here, everything was real, not fiction. The story ended well, fortunately. But the realization of what could have happened, what these people had endured, chilled the heart. The woman and the boy finally got up from the grass. Together, tightly embracing, accompanied and supported by the police, they walked towards the ambulance. As they passed Ryan, Eth stopped, touched him with his hand, and quietly, barely audibly said, "Thank you." Ryan just shook his head in response, unable to find words. What thanks could there be? And what, strictly speaking, had he done that was so special? He just stopped and called the police. That was all his involvement. And then the guy met the gaze of the woman, the boy's mother. She had a beautiful face, regular features, and a smile. A beautiful, gentle, bright smile. Looking at her, it was hard to believe that this woman had endured so many terrible trials. She had been held captive for several weeks and had just been in mortal danger. But it was utterly impossible to tell from her face. It radiated peace. Ryan suddenly felt a strong desire to talk to her, to find out what had really happened, to ask if she and the boy needed his help. But the woman and Eth were already being led to the ambulance. As she got into the ambulance, Eth's mother suddenly turned back to Ryan and smiled at him again. The guy felt as if he had been struck by lightning from head to toe. He felt a strong electric shock. It seemed that this smile made an even greater impression on him than the rescue story itself. Ryan understood that he would now often remember this episode, this look, this smile. The city was once again stirred by a story that had already begun to fade from memory. The woman and the boy, Christine and Ethan, were found alive. What had happened to them was a ready-made, chilling plot for a real thriller. Mother and son had become victims of Alexander, a man with a confirmed psychiatric diagnosis. Many acquaintances of this man didn't even suspect that he was seriously ill. Alexander had friends, he worked, he lived the life of an ordinary person. True, the 36-year-old man lived with his mother and didn't have a girlfriend. But nowadays, that's not so strange. It happens. It seems Alexander saw Christine's photo on social media and immediately fell in love with the beautiful woman. The fact that she had a child didn't stop him at all. The man tried to start a relationship with the beauty. He wrote her long, passionate declarations of his feelings, waited for her with flowers at her building entrance. But Christine, first politely and then in a categorical manner, asked him to leave her alone and stop harassing her. Alexander couldn't accept the refusal. Whether it was his stubborn nature or a consequence of his illness, the man firmly decided to get what he wanted no matter what. He set up a cabin in the forest, carefully prepared everything for a long stay, even lined the walls with insulation material. He planned to keep his captives there even in winter. And then he tracked down and took Christine and Eth when they were returning home from the cinema. Mother and son were searched for everywhere. Even the most incredible theories were considered, including that they had been taken to another country. And all this time they were quite close, just a few dozen kilometers from the city. He kept us in cages, in confinement, Christine shared in one interview, trying to remain calm. He didn't touch us, didn't hit us, didn't threaten us, nothing like that. He brought food, cared for us in his own way, talked to us a lot, tried to convince us. But we were, of course, very afraid of him. I immediately understood that this person was not well, and that anything, the most unpredictable actions, could be expected from him. Therefore, as soon as there was the slightest opportunity, I helped my son escape. And he, my little hero, brought help. Christine and Eth became famous throughout the country. They even flew to Moscow for a popular talk show to tell their story. Their tragic story was now known throughout the country. Ryan was also invited to these shows and gave interviews. Of course. After all, it was he who found the frightened boy on the road and called the police. But the guy refused publicity. He didn't want all this fuss and attention to himself. He watched Christine from the side, looked at her photos online, admired her on the TV screen. Yes, Alexander could be understood. There was something very attractive, magnetic, about this woman. Not just outward beauty, which was undoubtedly fully present. Charm, fascination, charisma, something intangible that caught the eye. And then, a few weeks later, this amazing, shocking story, as usually happens in the age of information noise, was forgotten, fading into the shadow of new events. New topics for talk shows and scandalous articles in the press appeared. And then, about a month after everything happened, Christine suddenly wrote to Ryan herself in a messenger app. She probably got his phone number from the police officers who investigated the case. The woman thanked the guy for his help and suggested meeting to discuss everything that had happened in person. Of course, Ryan gladly and eagerly agreed to the meeting. He really wanted to see this amazing woman, hear her voice, learn about everything that had happened firsthand, without distortion. After all, the guy, unlike other ordinary people, perfectly understood that he would never forget this story. It would forever remain in his memory. He often remembered Christine's smile directed at him and his strong feelings about it. And sometimes he would dream of Eth, just as the boy had emerged from the forest, disheveled, frightened, all crumpled and dirty. Ryan really wanted to know how the boy was feeling now, whether he had recovered from the horror he had experienced. The boy didn't participate in talk shows, and almost nothing was said about him in articles. Obviously, Christine was protecting her son from excessive attention from the press and public. Well, she could be understood. It was the right decision. At the appointed time, Ryan arrived at the restaurant where Christine had arranged the meeting. He saw her immediately upon entering. The woman was sitting at a far table in the corner of the hall, gazing thoughtfully out the window, lost in her thoughts. Long chestnut hair framed her narrow face with regular features. A dark turtleneck and tight jeans emphasized the graceful curves of her figure. She looked beautiful, composed, but somehow a little detached, withdrawn into herself. In Ryan's soul, some strange mixed feelings stirred upon seeing this woman. There was nothing romantic in them, although Christine's appearance was quite conducive to such impulses. Ryan still only dreamed of Sarah. His heart belonged to her. But Christine clearly attracted him, intrigued him, occupied his thoughts. "Good afternoon," Ryan greeted politely, approaching her table. He was suddenly overcome by a strange, completely unexpected awkwardness, like in his youth. And when the woman turned her gaze of incredible, deep gray eyes on him, the guy even seemed to blush. This hadn't happened to him when interacting with the opposite sex for a long time. "Hello," Christine smiled charmingly, her smile as bright as it had been that evening. "Finally, I can thank you in person, looking you in the eye." "But I didn't do anything special, really," Ryan replied sheepishly. "I just called the police, that's all. But your son is a real hero. He saved you." "Well, how to put it?" Christine's face darkened for